Hey everybody, it's Justin here, and
Eric here.
yep,
Yep. I thought you
dynamic
might need to look
duo
back.
at it again. Back at news because we don't have a game to play, or
We
maybe,
do. Yeah,
yeah,
we're still figuring out some technical stuff, and we want to make sure we don't want to spend half the show doing technical difficulties.
yeah, yeah, like we did with like the first game stream on the PlayStation 5. That was a good time.
Yep.
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 But yeah, probably in the coming weeks we'll try to take a look at Hi-Fi Beat because I think our specific expertise in game audio and the systems around that, and not only that, but Hi-Fi Beat kind of replicating a lot of the goals that we had when we created Choreographer Cinema. We might be able to lay some insight into what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether or not they're pushing it as far as they could go
Yeah.
given the experiments that we've done. I don't want to make any claims because I haven't really played the game to say much about it, but it should be an interesting like breakdown of what their systems look like and what they're doing. My only concern is that Hi-Fi Beat I think has what's it called, like commercial music in it that may limit usage.
No. Yes, but also no. Hi-Fi Beat, when you first turn it on, it says, "What music tracks do you want?"
Oh,
They
smart.
have they have a streamer mode. Yeah, specifically they're like, if you're streaming, if you're not streaming, don't worry about that. Enjoy the licensed music that we've paid for.
Yeah,
But if you are potentially going to stream this or want to record it, you may want to consider flipping this on because we can guarantee that you won't get content strikes or anything
that's
like that.
clever. I like.
Yeah.
There's other games that do this, and they don't do it as effectively.
Yep.
So it's nice to see that they actually thought ahead, and it's also in their own best interest to have
Oh
streamers
yeah.
streaming their game and selling it word of mouth style. So yeah, it's in their best interest to do it as well. So
Yeah.
cool.
It's also nice to have that being called out sort of as a specific thing, like right as you start up the game, at least on PC. Don't know about on the Xbox, but on PC, it does come up and say this, and it brings that issue sort of like right to the forefront. Even if you're not a streamer, now you might understand why
Yeah,
streamers play with music off in many cases,
right, right.
that kind of thing.
And in a game
So,
like that, like you specifically can't. So
right. Yeah. Yeah. The whole point of it is interesting, musical gameplay and musicality. So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to checking it out and actually giving it a good try. It looks interesting either way. I'm glad they're
Yeah.
sort of pushing the boundary of what rhythm gameplay action can look like and whether or not, I mean, they suggest that you don't have to play rhythmically, but that you are given bonuses if you do. So I'm curious what that looks like and if it actually sounds good.
Yeah, it having played 45 minutes or so of it so far, just dipped my toe into it. I can say that there are definitely some rhythm game sort of, it taps into the rhythm
Yeah.
game mechanics pool, but at the same time, it doesn't uh, directly, at least in the 45 minutes from what no expert at the game yet, but in those 45 minutes, it doesn't explicitly penalize you for not playing to the beat.
I mean, they called that out in the Xbox Direct presentation. That was like, oh, it's not required,
Right. But
but yeah,
but they still grade you every combat scenario you're in, and when it wraps up, they give you an like the standard Japanese
yeah. Given the
gameplay.
developer, it makes sense. You're like, you got an S.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
It's that grade scale. Like,
yeah,
did you get an S like for superb or whatever, or A
yeah,
B C D, or ABC?
yeah.
So
I remember Beautiful Joe, and they would actually like tell you what it was. So it's like I don't remember what S was, but I know C was crappy. It'd be like C crappy. Yeah,
that
it's
was
like
so
thanks,
much
Beautiful
style, man.
Joe. Not an
Yep.
easy game, and actually, not the same developer, but I think maybe he was on that team when they were to develop Beautiful Joe because it was Grasshopper.
Yeah, it was grasshopper manufacturer. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways,
Yeah. Anyway.
if you came in here to chime in to or like to get updated on the latest video game industry news, that's what we do. We have three topics that we cover every week. which seems to be what we've like kind of rested into. But we'll talk in depth on more of the interesting industry-based news, especially given like a lot of the acquisitions that have been trying to happen and a lot of the changes in the industry. It's kind of an interesting time to hear some more in-depth discussion on those news topics. So that's what we do. If you like it, follow along, follow us, and you'll get more of that. And then every once in a while, I guess we do Let's Play, which we have only done once at this point.
Once so far.
To
Yeah.
play through
Well,
A Way Out.
yeah. And figuring out how that, how do we make that work for us? Like what A Way Out was an interesting thing that we happened upon just on our own outside of Sonic Bloom Live, and we were like, this is potentially a really interesting thing we could do together and talk about the game and angles we see in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But strangely enough, there's not that many multiplayer co-op games, so
yeah, right.
It's
surprising.
We have a small pool to work from if we're both going to be doing it.
Yeah.
Anyways, let's jump into the news topics. Do you want to recap them?
Sure. So today we're going to look at Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation abandoning E3 as it comes back this year post-pandemic into its more usual form. Those three have opted to not participate in any meaningful way, although they may have their own sort of tricks up their sleeve, and we'll get into that. Item number 2 is game developers agree with regulators aiming to remove non-competes from contracts. And that is the in the United States, at least, there is a movement by the federal government to strike down and make effectively illegal any non-compete clause to help workers be able to transition, take their skills and apply them and find a job after, post-employment with wherever they sign this non-compete. And this is the Game Developer Magazine did an interview with a bunch of people and found that, this is a thing in the games industry as well. Both Justin and I have firsthand experience with that as well. And, what does it look like from the game developer space? We'll get into that a bit. And then finally, catching up on the Microsoft Activision Blizzard King deal. And on that, it's basically, we say catching up on because we have been following that. If you've been following us on our show, we have been following the drama associated with that purchase since it was announced. What was it, like mid 2021, early or sometime in 2021? I believe. Maybe early 2022. It's been a while.
Yeah, I think it was early or late 2021.
Yeah, it might have been December or November 2021 or something. Because it was also around the time, I believe, of the harassment stuff coming out about Activision.
Shortly thereafter, Microsoft's like, perfect time as your stock price drops.
Right. And that was during, I remember that being in the fall leading into the holiday season. Yeah. As my recollection, which could be busted, whatever. Anyway, those are the 3 topics we're going to cover. Justin, do you want to rehash the first item today and we'll dive into it?
I sure do. Well, let's talk first about Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation, the big 3 leaving E3. Which, I mean, if you've been following E3, it's a little predictable. But basically, the saga of E3 was, for a long time, it's been under pressure to change because the function of E3 is a little, I'd say a little bit backwards at this point. And it has trouble really finding what its purpose is. And then on top of it, there's also issues like harassment on the show floor, harassment of people in costume, and then the booth babe thing where a lot of game publishers would hire scantily clad women to try to attract young men into their to try out games, which was a little, it's misogynist for one, and it was indicative of the way the game industry had kind of developed into, where it was this thing that was supposed to be for young men, and even though the demographics of gaming had changed, and not only that, using women to sell a game is not exactly how you want to portray a diversifying game space. So for rightful reasons, they were kind of kicked in the shins on that one and asked to like, hey, maybe this is tacky and shouldn't be done anymore. So that was like one of the first issues, and then it kind of streamed into um, uh, like what the actual purpose of E3 is, because it's supposed to be uh, like a retailer event more than anything else, and it then turned into this way that like the major platforms could kind of cast a here's what our 1 to 2 year outlook looked like, and with the like modern streaming and all that stuff, uh, basically all these publishers can skip right around that and be like, we don't want to spend a lot of money to be at a trade show that's supposed to be only for like industry folks, particularly retailers and press, when we can have full control of this ourselves. And then Nintendo was the first to bail on it, I think, almost completely. And this is far before like COVID 2022.
Yep.
But then Sony, I think in 2020, was like, yeah, we're not attending either. And they were the second to really back out. And at the time being, Xbox is like, we're stepping in. We have an Xbox to announce. We'll take over that spot. We'll have a big press release. And keep in mind that also during the same time, Nintendo was still doing the Direct. Sony was still doing their press events. So like the press events were still happening, but the presence on the show floor kind of waned, yeah. And then in 2021, I think E3 was E3 happened.
Yeah.
But on with a reduced floor presence, reduced staff, because this was during COVID, so they didn't have people there.
Was there an an in-person presence for 2021?
In 2021, it was really, really limited. So they had publishers there, and they had like a broadcast stage where they were streaming stuff from, which I think was largely hosted by Jeff Keighley, and it was basically Summer Games Fest in light that was happening on the E3 show floor. And I'm assuming that there were an amount of people there that were in support staff or press or whatever else, but I think they were just basically like public, and a lot of retailers are just not going to be coming. Yeah. So they had like a really, really reduced presence, and it was mostly for press and streaming purposes. And then weirdly in 2022, they're like, we're actually not going to be doing this now for this year, because COVID kept on happening, and we had a bad spring season, and that's when Jeff Keighley kind of stepped in and said, we're going to do Summer Games Fest, which he's been slowly building up the press around that. And it's still not quite E3-ish, but it had like a long showcase where they showcased a lot of like indie games in particular, or smaller published games. So like a lot of the big three kind of moving out of that space allowed for games like what's it called? Blanking on the name of it. It's the Dead Space-like game that just came out.
Callisto Protocol?
Yeah, gave them like a really great opportunity to show off to everybody what they had been working on. And admittedly, it looked pretty good. So like that kind of opened up that space. But in the same year, E3's like, hey, guess what? We're actually coming back. But we're going to try to refocus what we're doing. And we're going to hire the group that like organizes the PAX shows, which is not a retailer event. PAX has always been like a consumer event.
Yep.
To like kind of figure out what E3 should be. They still don't claim they're a consumer event. So I'm not really sure if it's if it's still a retailer event, or if it's retailer consumer press, like what actually is it now. But they've taken over charge of trying to figure out exactly what E3 should be. But as they're trying to like reinvent themselves, in 1 week, Nintendo, which wasn't likely to be there anyways because they just haven't been in the past couple of years, Sony, which again predictable because they hadn't been for the last 2 years, but Xbox was a kind of strange one with them going like, we're not gonna have presence on the show floor either. So now it leaves E3 largely vacated of the largest publishers, and leaving it up to third-party publishers, indies, and whatever else for some type of expensive press event for companies. Now, they did make a couple statements. One is which like Nintendo was basically said, "Hey, we don't have a strong lineup for the majority of the year. We have stuff that's going to be coming out by summer, but I have a feeling that the tail end of the year is either pretty sparse or it's mostly going to be riding on the games that they just showed at their Nintendo Direct, like this week actually.
Yeah.
And so they're like, yeah, we don't have much to show on the show floor. Never mind a press event, so we're out." And I think Xbox is kind of in the same spot. I don't think they'd be as willing to admit it,
Yeah.
but a lot of their
Yeah.
big games are either not ready to be like have people playing it on the show floor, or there may not be a strong lineup. The biggest one being like Starfield, of course.
Yeah. I mean, some of them may already, their bigger ones may also, according to their developer direct that they did, are supposed to be out already by that time. Some
Yeah,
of the bigger
exactly
ones
right.
that
Like
we're
their
waiting
big
for, like,
Forza
yeah.
and the other one that looks kind of like Dead, or it kind of looks Left 4 Dead mixed
Redfall.
with it. Yeah, Redfall. There we go.
Yeah.
I'm blanking
Yeah.
on game names today.
That's all right. I'm not for once.
Yeah, just like what's that game called? Redfall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of their announced games that people that we know are supposed to be coming out are aimed for the early part of the year. So that leaves like after E3, like what exactly is there? And from Microsoft, it's like Starfield's supposed to come out. I presume it still is, but they may not. They may be pushing Bethesda to be like, I don't want playable demo on the show floor. That gives a bad impression of what this is. So like, just keep hammering away on it and get it out by whatever September, October, or whenever it's supposed to actually release.
There's also a really weird space for demos. Like if a game is supposed to be one where you're expected to spend 40, 60 hours in it, it's hard to give someone an experience that's representative that they can sit down at for 3 minutes. And
not only that, but like the
and feel like,
development
oh, yeah,
time
that's
to
great.
create like a really contained, like here's 10 minutes of gameplay that's going to give you a strong idea of what the game is that feels polished, means that like you have to have either a polished game or you spend a lot of development time on polishing this one area, which sidetracks your development team to try to get something to show off to the press for a game that's supposed to be released out later. So I think it's just logistically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for these publishers to come out swinging like that unless it's a game that's supposed to be releasing in the next, 2 months or had already released within like that time frame. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, what Xbox did say is they will have a press event at E3. Well, not at E3, but around E3 like they've always done. The difference from what I think is rumored is that usually if you had an E3 press badge or attendance badge, you could go to the Microsoft event that was some located theater nearby and get in with that. And I guess they're saying not this time.
Yeah, they used to do with the keynotes, right? They'd have their own
Right.
or their own big E3 keynote presentations. The big three did them, probably 2 decades ago now. But
Yeah.
you had Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, and before that was probably Sega, Nintendo, and Microsoft.
Yeah.
And they would give us, that here is a year of what's coming to our console.
Yeah.
Or that would also be the place where you get the major console announcements, like, oh, Microsoft's going to announce their new Xbox,
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
I mean, even in like, what was it? So 2020, I think when Sony was doing theirs more regularly. I mean, they did another one in 2021. 2022 is the off year where in 2022 they're just like, we're not doing one. And then we got one like in September, which was odd. And then we haven't gotten any big press announcements besides them like having some smaller like whatever Sony. I don't even remember what they call them. Like their directs, basically. They had smaller ones.
No, it's State of Play.
State of Play, right? Yeah. So Sony State of Plays were speckled throughout the year, but we haven't had a big press announcement one since I think September, October in 2022. And that's when we got some like no, not September, October 2022. September, October 2021 is the last big one they did. And then they had smaller ones after that. 2021 was when they showed off, hey, Spider-Man, Wolverine, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah, they had the huge, sure.
Yeah, and that was the last one we got. So like we've gone like a full year and we're creeping into E3, and Sony is still kind of like, yeah, we got nothing.
I think it may have been that like what we're seeing there. This is speculation here. It's hashtag speculation. Uh, this may be what we're seeing is the gap, the breathing room that Sony has allowed their first party development teams between games that were transitionary like cross-gen titles and the titles that are going to be exclusively PS5 as they're trying to like really show off what the PS5 can do, really hone in on that. And also like these projects would have had to have started in 2020, 2021 most like. So they're, and for a AAA title that takes 3 to 5 years to develop.
Yep.
There's a gap. There's some ramp up time. So Sony's like, you know what? We have a couple in the pipe. We've got, they had God of War, they had Horizon Forbidden West.
Yeah.
And they still have a couple others that are coming. I think that the cross-gen titles are mostly done at this point. But
yeah.
I think
the weirdest thing is that they're launching the PSVR. There's not been a standalone press event for that.
No, they've been
they had like the first half of one where they're like, we're going to show off Horizon Call of the Wild or Call of the Mountain, excuse me. And then
they've shown that twice at 2 different things, I think.
Yeah, they were also at TGS when they showed that off.
That's where it was. I was thinking it was like CES or something, but I think you're right. It was. And TGS.
I think around TGS is when they did this press event. So like it was kind of a twofer.
TGS is Tokyo Game Show for those who don't know. It usually happens in late summer, early fall.
September, yeah, usually around September-ish. But so they did their big press thing there. But now it's spring, and the platform is launching in the next month.
It's like weeks away.
Yeah, exactly. And and I think they have like 30 some odd games that they're launching with it. Not like really big games. A lot of them are ports over from the just legacy VR platforms.
Yeah.
Call of the Mountain's the biggest one. And they did like a press event for that, but it was a state of play ish, but it was mostly like one of their indie ones, with the biggest, announcement was like the showing a couple of minutes of gameplay from Call of the Mountain. So now we're launching a platform and we still haven't had an update. So it's just a very perplexing to me that Sony has basically been like, we're taking a year off from real press announcements. I don't know if it means that they're coming into E3. They have not announced an E3 press thing.
Part of it may be that they haven't seen, like they've been struggling to keep up with demand for the PS5 in general. So that might be a piece of it, is that like, well, let's hold off on these things until we get to a point where we see that we need to, put a lot of money into marketing. It sells itself right now. Like we don't even need to throw money at it and it sells itself. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what they're honestly like. I think, I don't remember what it was, but, the PSVR 2, in particular, like their manufacturing capacity is probably limited, given that they're using like a pretty interesting components that are not the easiest to source. They know they're in the spring cycle, so they're not like, we're not going to sell a ton until Christmas, and like the holiday season in general. And then they're probably like, yeah, if we get a huge amount of demand and we're not able to meet it, we're just going to anger a lot of people when we really should be like sort of counting on the holiday sales. And I guess as of right now, they're not even supplying it to retailers. It's specifically through like PlayStation Direct. So it's the only way you can get a PSVR 2 for now. So I think they're intentionally suppressing the sales because they don't want to deal with supply issues, and I think they'd probably rather come out swinging for the holiday. So that might be why they're kind of holding back, and knowing that the hardcore gamers are really the people who are going to be picking it up on day one, and then by holiday they need to make a wider appeal to a broader gaming audience to try to sell more during that holiday season.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they haven't announced an E3 presence yet. It's not to say they won't, but
or
maybe
what they're
I mean, we know Spider-Man 2 is supposed to be like, it's not they're gonna. I can't imagine them pulling a God of War where they're just like, it exists and here's like a 3-minute gameplay and then it's launched. I imagine that they'll have some bigger press event surrounding that game and with the proper release date and probably targeting holiday 2023.
It may get its own announcement or something.
Yeah.
Focus thing.
So, given the state of things, right? Because I think I've recapped
Pretty much all of it.
all of E3, yeah, up until this point. Like, do you think that sort of the big three pulling out is a trend that we should expect to continue, uh, or
Uh,
or like a temporary thing because of COVID and whatever else?
No, I think it's the thing we should expect to effectively like it almost feels silly to have E3 around. PAX filled in a huge gap
Yeah,
by allowing developers to speak directly um, uh, uh, to consumers, right? You go to different regions, at least in the United States. Actually, I think some of them. Isn't there one in Australia?
yeah. I mean, they have a bunch of different regional
There's a
ones.
couple. Yeah,
Yeah,
they may have expanded beyond the U.S., but they for a while, at least in the beginning, they were just like East and West and maybe South.
yeah. Then they
And
have
I think they've
South. Yeah,
yeah, and they've expanded beyond that. So like, but you know, those were places where developers from all over the world could come in and have a E3 style presence, but then invite players to come in and try the latest games before they were released. Now it has the same things that we were talking about before, where yeah, you as the development team have to really polish this one tiny sliver of your game to show it off. And to make it so that your players won't have a terrible experience and then trash the game in social media and whatever before it comes out and break
right.
all your marketing. But it's also a great way if you can nail that experience to get hype going and all that other stuff. Now, the thing about E3 to me is we were talking about it. You referred to it, and especially earlier on in the show, as a sort of a retailer
Yeah,
focused show, and it started that way. It was sort of a way for retailers to come in and have that. Retailers like the Walmarts and Targets and game stores and video stores and anywhere that would sell video games to come in and say, okay, what are the latest games? We're buyers, right? We're going to figure out which games we want to put on our shelves. This is the old school brick and mortar like
yeah. And they'd
sourcing.
place an order for physical sales and
Yeah.
bargain for shelf placement and in like end cap placement, etc.
Yep. E3 had sort of two, and it may still in when it's in person, but it had two levels. There was the downstairs and there was the upstairs. And the downstairs, at least the year I went, the downstairs had, which was I think the last huge year, 2005. At any rate, the downstairs had this like set of cubicles. It was all these temporary walls that were built up. It was very quiet. You could go down there, wander around. There were a few little things like games set up on PCs along the walls that where they were showing off some this or that. But generally, what those were places where the publishers and the developers, self-published publishers, would bring in and invite people in to do those deals. They were working out the numbers. Okay, when are you shipping? What does it look like for holiday stuff? Blah blah blah. Like let's have a conversation. I have a meeting over there with Activision, and I know you guys are trying to sell me stuff Acclaim, but like whatever, and trying to strike deals that way. Cool. There is a value to that. There's a huge purpose to that for these companies to go there. On the flip side, the upstairs was for journalists. It was
Yeah,
for people to go and GDC has this to an extent as well, but for a different purpose. But they had parts of the upstairs booths where there was sort of the plebeian area where you could go in and just sample the games, and that's where all the booth babes were and whatever. But if you had a meeting set up, you could go into a back door of the stage, and inside the booth, they'd have a little meeting room where you could hang out with some of the president of the company or
right. And
whatever.
that's where like the press would come up and have one-on-one interviews with the people who created the game.
Exactly. And so you have those two sets of opportunities that you didn't ever get anywhere else. And on the retail side, brick and mortar stores that would figure out, okay, how are your games getting to market that way? On the journalism side, it was okay, what magazines, what video game magazines, and to an extent burgeoning websites, early web 2.0, web 1.0 websites are going to be writing about this, where game geeks are going to like just read through that stuff, every little bit that they can get. So there's those two purposes. Right now, the world we live in now and the world we're heading towards has a heck of a lot less of that retail side consideration. Like,
Right. Given that like 80% of sales are done digitally now.
Exactly. There are some physical, and like really, you could just say like, oh, we're just going to put our physical on our own website and ship it to you because it cuts down
Right.
on our costs.
I mean, and
And
like even when I was in the game industry, which was a bit ago, and when we needed to have retail presence, like they still only focused on like the largest retailers. It was like Walmart,
yeah,
Target, and like
and
Toys
you
R
can
Us if you're in Canada.
right, and you can get a sales rep to those people with the right connections. You just effectively develop a relationship. There's no need to go to a big store, a big show for that
Right.
at that point. So, if you have a much smaller amount of sales opportunities and like places to sell through brick and mortar wise, most of your sales are going direct through platform anyway now because we're shifting towards digital. On the journalism side, everyone is connected to the internet every day, almost every second that they're awake. And you can get notifications like some of the marketing people do these days goes through TikTok.
Yeah.
And that's going to hit way, way more people than you going to a show and showing it to a bunch of people that you hope are going to then broadcast it the same way that you could just by putting it on
Right.
YouTube or TikTok yourself. Like it's a
Yeah.
lot of money to be at a show like that. And the benefits are really going down. That's where this like reinventing what E3 means and is for the business is important. I personally don't see a way for them to really do it unless they turn it into a like effectively a summer festival where they
Yeah.
invite
Or like a
consumers
PAX
in.
like.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And like it's indicative that they brought in the PAX organizational team
Yeah.
to
Agreed.
do it because it would seem that they're trying to make it a consumer event, which would make sense. Like it makes
Yeah.
sense that you'd have a consumer event, but that means you're gonna have to adjust like what exactly is a publisher going to pay to be at there, like to be there, uh, and like if the press is not gonna have as strong as a presence there as they used to, I think it's a harder call for asking large publishers to pay the amount of money that they were paying to be at PAX when it's
Yeah.
not geared at like a lot of press coverage. It's geared at like consumers wanting to play, some games ahead of time. And PAX already kind of fills that hole based off of like different times of the year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, like I think the biggest challenge they have ahead of them is like E3 just really needs to figure out like what are they supposed to be now, given that the way that they were able to charge as much money as they were and create that sort of like large press event was because they were reliably the only way to do it, and now that streaming and everything else can circumvent everything that they had like that they were purporting to have value in. If that's been eroded, it's like yeah, either reinvent yourself or like actually shut down for good because the publishers don't even care. Like the biggest publishers don't even care to be there. And if they have to bargain basement their presence cost for a publisher, then it also means that hey, like now indies and smaller game titles might actually have a chance of having a presence there and getting press attention. So maybe it will self balance, but I just don't see a way that E3 is going to be the E3 it was 5-10 years ago.
No, I agree. And I think yeah, as you mentioned, them bringing the PAX folks in is a recognition internally that like there's really not a good place for this. Like I'm sure that they in the last few years and even right now are surveying developers and publishers and saying like, what did you think of the last E3? And like, what was it worth your money and time? On a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, where did it fall on this? We get these things after GDC as well, where GDC is like, how is it? And it's always like, yeah, if you didn't charge as much, I feel like I got better bang out of my buck.
Yeah.
GDC is very expensive
Yes.
to attend. It is a
But
privilege.
I think E3, at least for the publisher, is even more expensive. Like for
Yes.
you to have a presence on the show floor.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the potential returns of that over the developer
with the
conference.
sort of press coverage that used to be there.
Yes, exactly. Assuming the old way they used to be able to charge like $1.5 million for a booth, like or for a presence on the floor, or whatever that number was. Like, yeah, that was because with a huge booth, you got a huge multi, in the magazines, you'd have a 3-page spread just focused to your cool stuff coming out and getting the energy and the readers excited.
Yeah. And I think what's kind of interesting is like Summer Games Fest with Jeff Keighley's like, hey, by the way, we're still doing Summer Games Fest. And last year he
Yeah.
showed like, hey, I don't need to have E3 to still have a show that has a lot of attention turned to it. I mean, which has also been proven with the Game Awards that he also
Yeah.
puts on. So, I don't know how they're going to do it. I think in 2021, Summer Games Fest was at E3, so they had like this press station where people would come up and they were broadcasting like 24/7 for like 2 days, where game publishers would come up and have kind of a controlled playthrough that could be broadcast through like one channel. Um, I don't know how he plans to do it this year and whether or not E3 even wants him there, given that in 2022 he's like, I'm doing it without you anyways. So yeah, these things are like heavy nails in the coffin, and if E3 relies on the presence on the show floor as their main way to make money, like what is the press advantage for you as a publisher to be like, I need to be there and pay lots of money instead of I need to just be at Summer Games Fest and pay less money and have a more controlled experience and have a better way of controlling the press on my game. Like, it makes
Uh,
it so that E3 really is kind of out of good options to show that it has value beyond what the other platforms are.
I mean, the Summer Games Fest is also mostly a streamed show, right?
They have a stream show, which is like their big keynote show, which I think last
Yeah.
year was like 2 hours
Yeah.
of game
Trailers.
announcements and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and
Almost
then
exhausting.
after that, they had like I think they had the PC show, so like the PC gaming show, and then they had they had like Schaefer's like indie show thing, which I think was
Yeah.
all part of Summer
Oh,
Games Fest.
yep.
I don't remember what it was called.
It wasn't like Attack of the Indies or something, right?
Yeah, it had a funny name, but it
Day
was
of the Devs. Day of the
yes,
Devs.
which was Tim Schafer's like hosted. I'm going to show off a bunch of really great indie titles,
Yep.
and then after that, there was stuff that was scheduled throughout like the week where they would have like blocks of time where devs could just do what kind of like I think it's Treehouse Live does with Nintendo, where
Yeah.
they would after their main press event, they would then go on and have the devs talk about the game while giving a playthrough. So if people want to see more about, I guess last year was a Kirby, they had people playing Kirby in the Forgotten Lands, I think it was called. Um,
Think so?
yeah. So, doing something like that, that's what Summer Game Fest kind of fills in as well. So, I don't know. E3 really needs to figure their stuff out before they continue on, and I'm not sure they really nailed it this year, unless they can
What?
really prove that their event has value to the publishers.
Yeah, the first headline I read about, or well, article I read about this when it was announced, it seemed that they were like E3 was still at the time. This was a few weeks ago, like 2 weeks ago or so. They were still figuring out, like no plans were set in stone yet. They were still working with potential partners, and that they had reached out to many publishers, and there was a lot of excitement and energy to bring it back into an in-person show. And so that could just be them doing their own marketing, and of course they're like required to say that by their investors or whoever is running the company.
Yeah.
But it could also be the truth, and if there is that, and if they are able to transition into something new and fresh, awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Hopefully they can. I mean, it's got the cachet still with the names, just
Oh,
they
yeah.
haven't been proving it lately. So
There was always it's like growing up with E3s, they were a yearly seminal event that it was always fun to look forward to and speculate about as, fans of games in general.
And now I just look forward to it's like, okay, when is one of the big three going to say that we have an event that actually is going to be substantial?
Right.
So, all right, well, let's move on.
Alrighty.
The next topic is game developers agree with regulators aiming to remove non-competes from contracts. Do you want to cover this a bit?
Yeah, sure. So the FTC in the United States, Federal Trade Commission, announced in January that it was sort of aiming to ban non-competes from employment contracts. Now, the non-competes are things that have been banned for many, many years in some states like California. But that is also not entirely the whole picture of what's going on with what a non-compete is. Like, well, a non-compete, let's define what that is specifically to start. Non-competes are statements in contracts. When you're hired, you sign, a contract of employment, and it will say something like, "You agree that if you leave this company, you will not enter into another contract or gain employment uh, with another company with which we are a competitor in any way."
Yeah.
And what that means is, like, if you're a game designer and your bread and butter skills, your core skills are, I do design for games, and you're like, okay, well, I left this company, I got to go find another company to work at. You cannot use one that is making games, because technically, if they put out a game, it's going to compete with your
Right.
prior employer, which is a serious problem for some states like California, where, if you're disallowing someone from using their trade skill, or their best capabilities, then that's a serious problem. States like Massachusetts don't have anti non-compete clauses in any of the state laws, so those still exist. And there have been situations in the past where that makes big, loud noise. There was one with harmonics where Justin and I have both had work, and if not been fully employed. Justin was fully employed. I was working as a sort of a subcontractor there. But anyway, they had a non-compete. Someone had signed it in 2011, and there was a big kerfuffle about that in the Boston Globe, Boston's major newspaper. And made headlines all over the place. California doesn't have that, but California also doesn't stop companies from doing this other sort of anti-competitive thing, which, as I understand it, is not being considered by the FTC under the auspices of these sort of federal level rules changes. And that is that you can, when you sign a contract with a company, the company can add restrictions into the work that you do at the time, stating anything that you work on while gainfully employed at said company is their work.
Yeah. It's like
which means
anything you do is owned by them.
Any side project. And I can tell you, I don't know a game developer who doesn't want to work on a game on the side.
Right.
Even if it's a small thing and they're just contributing with, in a tiny way, it's a passion and they want to do some measure of something. And those types of clauses do exist in the games company. Now, one of the escape hatches for that is you can go into a company, and frequently they'll have a way for you to write out, okay, here are the IPs, the intellectual property, the titles, or the products that I have already been working on prior to coming into this company. I agree to not start any new project, but any work that I do on these pre-existing projects is mine. You can't have it. And you sort of carve that out as your own stuff. Yeah. So that is one thing that you can frequently negotiate. In my experience, I've been able to do that. I can't speak for everybody, in every possible contract out there. But that has been my understanding going into these things, is that is one of those things where some people look at it and go, yeah, but the law and things that can be argued in law are frequently sort of absurd, right?
Right.
I'm making a mobile game that is, effectively a small trading card game, and how is that going to compete with a first-person shooter console game that I'm making at my day job?
Right.
But they'll still argue, nope, they're game players. It's targeting gamers, so by definition, anyone who plays that game is a gamer, and therefore is potentially our target audience, and therefore you are competing with us.
Yeah.
And that's really the thing, is that that's a non-compete. That's why we're bringing this up, is because it's a non-compete of another name.
Right.
It's we don't want you to compete with us at the time of your employment, instead of you can't find work after you leave us with one of our competitors. So it's the two sides of the same coin, really. Yeah.
They'll also sneak in extra clauses. So usually a non-compete agreement is it's separate paper that you'll sign out in with your normal employment contract. But in the states of California, whether or not it's legal, the other thing they can do is sneak in clauses within the main contract. It's just as an employee you won't do this, or after employment you won't do this. And it's kind of saber rattling more than anything else, because it's like it's not necessarily enforceable, but you also may not have the money to challenge it in court if a large publisher decides to try to come after you because they feel like you may have taken their IP to another game company that could be in direct competition with them.
Yep. So that's this being looking at the what is, at least in the United States, a nationwide sort of overall work issue and sort of question that we're posing to workers. I mean, this is all sort of happening in the space when workers' rights and questions about pay and pay disparity between executive level and higher, and or that tier-ish, and like this, the bulk of the workforce, like the widening gap there. We have a seeming rise in what are the unions, the unionization efforts across the board. Sort of the game industry is sort of a microcosm of all of that happening at the same time. And for us in the game industry, this is particularly relevant because like our skills are so, to an extent, so at least in some disciplines, perhaps game design, level design, are pretty specific to the industry to an extent. Some of the stuff like project management, engineering to a degree, and some of these other things, depending on what engineering you do, are portable. Yeah, you could go and get a job at a bank if to do a project there, or IT there, or whatever, and still be okay. But is it going to be your passion? Is it going to be the real, like, where your specialty is? No.
Right.
And that's sort of what this is about. Justin, have you been affected by non-competes or the other thing we were talking about, either of the modes of non-competes that we've been talking about?
I mean, not explicitly, but I think there's another thing to bring up too, which is like that another way that this kind of screws employees is that if, say, like a large company like Activision uses non-competes. I'm not saying that they do because I haven't been employed by them to know. But say they employ non-competes as a way to try to keep people in positions, and they defend that, and they go like, we don't want our IP leaking out with an engineer that leaves the company. If they actively defend it, other companies will know that Activision defends non-competes, and will, when looking to hire someone, sometime will ask, like, did you work for any of these employers before? Oh, you have before. Sorry, we can't hire you because we know it's a problem, and we know that
it's a risk.
Yeah, it's a risk to them that, that, I don't know. I mean, say me leaving Harmonix, I want to go work at Activision on the team at like Beanox, who was doing, I think, Guitar Hero at the time. Had I done that, they would have been like, oh, you work for Harmonix. Like, not a chance. We don't want to deal with any of the idea that we, took protected IP and used it in their game. So those are the things that also prevent employees from being able to get gainful employment when their skills that were honed in one job may be best ported over to another job that has a lot of parallels. That is what non-competes can really screw with. And on top of that, it's just like a legal shield that, like, they're rarely actually leveraged.
Yeah.
But they are enough legal threats to a person that, if the company decides to go after them because they feel like they were wronged in some way, you signed a contract that said, yeah, you weren't going to do it, and then you did, and now there's legal recourse because you broke what the contract was for. And then another way that I've also seen it abused, and this is actually something that did happen with Harmonix, was that in order for them to write you out of your non-compete, a lot of the times it comes with, you will agree that here's the compensation you'll get, but if you take this compensation, this is what happens. And I don't think it was leveraged in malice at Harmonix per se, but I know other people have been wanting to get out of a contract, and in so doing would have to like waive packages, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
basically like if you want to get your compensation for being laid off, like you have to honor the non-compete.
yeah, yeah,
And if you don't, we will sign you out of your non-compete, but you're not going to get any of the compensation. You won't get like a month's worth of pay or 2 months worth of pay or whatever it is.
yeah.
So yeah, not with me specifically, and also because I moved usually away from like when I left Harmonix, I went into a company that was working on their own media player operating system, so it wasn't really a parallel to
Yeah,
what
it's different.
Harmonix was doing. But you know, could I have moved to something like Beanox, who was working on Guitar Heroes? Like that would have been a pretty clear path forward, but I doubt I would have been able to allow. I doubt I would have been allowed to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I had like you, I have not had a situation come up where I have been disallowed employment or been dinged from prior employment. However, I did have a weird situation where I was hired by a small indie game studio in Boston, and working with them, they were hired by Harmonix to help with development. That's how I ended up working with Harmonix,
Yeah.
and on some projects. Now, the project that I was brought into was not a problem. It was a new project. It had nothing to do with any of the games I'd worked on in the past. But there was another project that they were doing some restructuring. They were looking at the multiple projects they had going at the same time. And they said, well, we want to reorganize. We're sort of moving this one into a different phase. We want to get more engineering effort on this. So we're going to take the subcontractors we've got and shift them onto this team. And when that word came through, I had to raise a concern because the project that they were working on dealt with an IP that may have had conflict of interest with a prior employer that I had, where they had been working on a project that worked in that same vein with that same IP, and I had signed an agreement to, what was it? It was this isn't even a non-compete. This was just an NDA.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's considered confidential. Like I had worked on a product that was not announced, and me working on that, going over and then working on what is effectively a very similar thing at this other studio, had this other company found out that I had been a part of that, that could have caused a legal issue. I brought that up with the company, and they decided to keep me still working there, but just on another product, and I would sub in for someone else who would go and work on that.
Right.
So that there was this like sort of legal hoop that needed to be jumped through as a result of that. Now that was an NDA, and sort of a non-disclosure agreement, a confidentiality agreement technically. And those I can fully understand. Those are like, look, we're developing this. You left while we were developing it. We may still ship it, and you agree that you're not going to take any of that understanding and hand it to our competitors, right? That's not that's information transfer, not necessarily skill application transfer.
Right.
It's a little bit gray, but at the same token, it's possible that I could have argued like, look, as long as I'm not taking the designs that I saw or the specific code implementation that I saw on that project and re-implementing it over here, I would have been safe. But Harmonix even agreed, let's not even cross that bridge. Like we don't need it.
It's like I don't want to deal with the problem. Yeah,
Exactly.
and like it's like there's other IP protection that exists. I think it's just maybe companies are like, I don't want to deal with the discovery process or anything like that, so we're not. And I think in the case of Harmonix, they had already dealt with discovery processes when they were challenging Activision for basically the same thing, saying that, hey, Activision has implemented code that was owned by Harmonix to create Guitar Hero 3. And so they had to go like through this discovery phase on both sides where they had to produce emails and whatever else that, would allow each lawyer to litigate against the other. And they probably got, I don't want to deal with that, but I feel like the non-competes cover an area of IP protection that the non-competes don't have to be used to leverage against, right? Like if I worked at Harmonix and I went to Activision and then I took things from Harmonix and Activision implemented them, and there was discussions of me that like that is IP
Clear
theft.
violation. Yeah.
And I like, that's where the protections are, right? Like
Yeah.
these extra clauses, the non-compete compete clauses, are ways more than anything else to prevent and scare employees from going and finding gainful employment with their skills elsewhere, and it can be leveraged pretty broadly given the way non-competes are worded. Like,
Yeah.
oh, it's another game, so you shouldn't be able to work there because I have an issue with it, and therefore I'm going to impact your gainful employment. And then in like the worst cases, it's actually used as like a cudgel to prevent people from seeking out employment elsewhere.
Yeah. And we should also point out that in the United States, this may be of particular import, because very frequently, or most of the time, healthcare is tied to employment.
Yeah.
And if you leave and can't get gainfully employed elsewhere, then great, you don't have healthcare. Or suddenly it's more expensive because you have to deal with COBRA, which is a sort of post employment way of getting
providing garbage healthcare.
Right. Yeah. Basically worse healthcare, like health insurance plan for way more money than you were paying before. It's like it's usually it has been my experience that it is better to just go back to the open market and find something that fits you there. And by that, the open market, I mean whatever like the Affordable Care Act provides. In the United States for those Americans listening, but so that's another angle that you have to consider is like, okay, if I have signed a non-compete and I want to leave because I don't like this company or I'm moving or any number of reasons, there's a better opportunity over there. And then, here comes the non-compete fairy telling you can't do that, but you've already left the company. Well, now you don't have health insurance. And it's also one of those things where you're like, okay, can I afford to leave the company?
Right.
If I lose healthcare, like that's going to raise my cost of living dramatically.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of sketchy things that companies do to try to maintain employment, where it's basically like, we dangle these things over your head, and we also reserve the right, because a lot of states are like at will.
At will employment. Yeah.
So basically, it's like they can hire you and fire you at will, without any reason. In places like that, it's just like, not only are we the ones that make it, because your health insurance is tied to your employment, that we can let you go whenever we want as well. But if you sign all these employment agreements, we can let you go whenever we want. But we also have non-compete agreements and stuff like that makes it more difficult for you to find a job. They're very anti-laborer, anti-labor laws. And I think, given what you said earlier to kick this whole thing off, is that, there has been a surge in labor pushes to have more protections for laborers, because there really aren't any in the United States, or very little at least. It's up to state, and most states opt not to actually do anything that impacts their ability to attract employers. And so in a lot of cases, it's kind of like race to the bottom. We found this with like tax write-offs for companies. Basically, I can say you don't have to pay taxes. In fact, I'll give you money to come here and employ people. And it became a race to the bottom. So like states like Texas, Ohio, were basically like, we'll give you money. And they're like, okay, we'll stay here, or we'll relocate here, and then we'll be here for the 3 years that you've given us tax write-offs, and then we leave. So it's like, it's that sort of thing. It's these sort of employment laws are races to the bottom for employers, and until the federal government steps in and does something more to it, like in a place like California, besides like the basically brain trust that they have as a state, if a company feels like they don't need to use that, they're better off going to other states, because other states are like, we don't care what you do. You can dump acid in waterways that people use for drinking, and we don't care. And so like, other companies will just be like, yep, and that's where we're going to go when it's easier to do that. So it creates this thing where employers will leave states based off of laws until the federal government says, hey, actually, we're banning it across. And so all states are equal in this regard.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like we've talked enough about that. We
Yeah.
wanna let's move on to the last topic.
Yeah. Catch us up.
Yeah, it's we're catching up on the Activision Microsoft deal. So we haven't covered it for a few weeks now.
Yeah.
There actually hasn't been a lot that's happened that I don't think has been covered. There's been some stupid like going back and forth, like including Bobby Kotick, like saying things towards the EU regulators, or like the UK regulators about like, oh, you know, you don't have a good argument about why the Microsoft deal shouldn't go through, which I don't agree with. And honestly, he's not impartial to the whole thing. So
Yeah. The least partial party.
yeah, right. Um,
I'm about to have a huge windfall of cash.
yeah,
You're wrong.
yeah,
Like, you want to stop me from my windfall of cash?
right.
Like,
So like, here's this guy speaking up, but I think the last thing we covered, and which is really relevant to this, is the UK CMA,
yep.
which is one of the last regulatory bodies that have had to approve this. So the last three are UK, EU, and US.
US.
All three have not approved the deal yet. But the UK CMAs in particular has been very vocal about why they don't think the deal should go through. And so the last time I think we covered this, the UK CMA was being like, we're going to extend our investigation into this. And that went from like late last year or maybe early this year. And they said, hey, we're going to kicking it until April, which did happen. And Microsoft's like, no, don't worry, it's fine. We think it's still going to go through, like sort of the puffing up your chest and being like, we've got this. But I think in reality, a lot of reports were like, there is some serious concern from Microsoft that that this won't go through. And then I think it was Bobby Kotick who actually said this. Said, hey, the UK regulators are in no place to be saying anything about this deal, given how the UK's economy is kind of crumbling in on itself, which is just like, I don't know, you're trying to like think rubbing salt in the eye of like the person who has to approve this is going to do you well, but that was the tact he went with.
Classy.
Either way, they finally decided to give their preliminary report on this, which was very negative. So to put this in perspective, their main case was that given Microsoft's verticality in the space, which is like to say in this one vertical, it has the tech to support it, which is the streaming tech, the infrastructure that can sell to others, plus the IP and property, and the Xbox platform, which makes it very difficult that if it grabs the content too, it has such a strong position in the space that it's going to be unfair to any other person competing in this space. And Sony was making arguments going, hey, this is bad for the gaming industry. Microsoft's main argument was actually it's good for the gaming industry. If we get a hold of this content, we'll make sure it will be more broadly available, and with our streaming platform, it will be made more available to more people at a lower price. Which, to be fair, the main crux of like Game Pass is that it's taking away the financial barrier of I need to have a console. Instead, I can pay a monthly subscription of like whatever it is, like $15 to get Game Pass Ultimate, and then I can just play games without a console. And
right, I buy a controller, and that's enough.
Right, and it's a reasonable approach to this because yeah, like to play a PS5 game, you're spending at least $400 to get a console to then start playing games. And Microsoft kind of took that away. I mean, they still say the best place to play is on the Xbox, but reality is like when Starfield comes out, if I want to play it, like I don't have to buy an Xbox. I can pay $15 for a month or two and play through the game, and the subscription. And I basically played a brand new game that would be priced at $70 for $30 and played through the whole thing. Yep. So they do have an argument there. However, it making the gaming landscape less competitive or making it healthier, I think that's where it's like, yeah, it's good for the consumer. It's not necessarily good for the industry as a whole. And I think that's the sort of approach that the CMA has taken with it. So their preliminary report was basically like, yeah, we don't buy that. We don't think there is. We think with this verticality of them, with the layers of technology that they have to support this sort of thing, and that Sony would probably have to buy or use an Azure-like service to have their own computing platform. And I think for the truth is that they do. I think they work with Microsoft to support their streaming game services.
Yeah, I don't know exactly which service they use to back them up.
They worked with Microsoft, and it was announced a couple of years ago that they were going to be working with Microsoft. And I'm not sure if it supports their game streaming service or if it's just like their PlayStation Network type services. But either way, they're paying Microsoft for PlayStation services as of right now, in some form. So that was one of their arguments. The other one is that they also don't think that Microsoft has any reason not to pull their titles, not least of which is from like the consoles themselves, which they've promised not to, and I think they signed a 10-year agreement with Nintendo that they would still allow like Call of Duty on the Nintendo platforms. Sony has refused to sign that, but like after those contracts are done, like what would stop Microsoft from being like, actually, we now find enough value in this, and we have enough of a user base that we don't feel like it is an advantage to us to put it on other consoles. So that we're going to remove it. Or in the other such scenario, it's exclusive to Game Pass. And if you want to be able to play these Activision games on a streaming service, because now streaming has taken over from consoles, it gives them kind of a monopoly in this area. Not a real true monopoly, but a lot of
sort of market strength
advantage. Yeah, in that space.
They'd be able to dictate terms or set pricing and things that others couldn't.
Given their acquisitions, I think they own like 60 to 70% of IP in the game space right now. If the Activision deal goes through, like it's that crazy. You're like, okay, well, who do they own? You're like, oh, yeah, that is a lot of game IP, legacy or current. They own an awful lot of it if the Activision deal goes through. So that was released. Now the report that was released is not a final conclusion, and Microsoft can come in and concede more to them, but I think their initial statement was that in order for them to concede, they'd have to spin off Call of Duty as its own company and separate it from the deal,
or sell it as an IP to another company.
Yeah, I mean, the way it would probably happen is Activision would then renegotiate the deal that they'd have. They'd pay a lower price, and then Activision would probably take back control of that to either be sold off or to be managed entirely on its own. In some way, right? Like, or the other suggestion was the entire Activision catalog, like IP catalog.
Yeah.
Which it was probably be a non-starter because I can't imagine that the company's worth $69 billion if it doesn't come with some of the biggest titles.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that was stated apparently was that the CMA said in their provisional thing, like, oh, if the agreement is nullified, then that also satisfies all of our concerns.
Yeah, like
which is like,
don't do the deal.
Just don't do the deal, and we don't have a problem.
Yeah, which is actually a pretty tough stance they're taking. They're like, basically, it's like you cannot own all the IP. Like that's what we're saying is you cannot own all the IP.
It's just too much right now.
Yeah,
I like they're giving them an opportunity to respond. By it was like April 2023 this year.
Yes.
So they're I can't remember. Maybe it was sometime in March. I think is when they have a due date for responses to the provisional, and then they're going to have their final report in April based on the responses. And so Microsoft and Activision Blizzard now have an opportunity to respond to what the UK has preliminarily said will, if this deal goes through, then there may be this deal may be expected to result in a substantial lessening of competition within the game industry, which is pretty damning as reports go. That is not looking posisive with the current structure.
Or they just concede a lot, like we will in contract say we, at least for the European or the UK, Call of Duty cannot be exclusive to any Xbox platform. It has to be published and allowed on any streaming platform, which
Yeah.
may satisfy part of their deal, like
Right.
where they own the profits of it, but they cannot control the IP. The IP has to be has to be used in other places. It's kind of like with like Sony's MLB The League. I think when the MLB license was renewed, they're like, you cannot make this exclusive to PlayStation anymore. And part of the agreement was like, okay, Sony's going to have to publish games on Xbox now, and they do, like, because that was part of the legal deal. I can imagine something like that may have to be conceded. It may be regional, it may be worldwide. It's unclear, and I also feel that the EU and the US are kind of waiting to see how the UK handles this before they move forward with their rulings. Because the US is also taking a kind of stiff stance, which is not typical of the US. But under this administration, it seems that that's a movement that they're making, which is like, hey, tech monopolies are getting worse and worse, and we actually have to take a stance on this.
A stance, yeah. I should point out that Microsoft has already responded once to, I believe, the CMA in particular. I think it was the CMA and not the EU.
I think they've responded to both, honestly, but
one of them, they had like a 12-page response where that bulleted list of like, here's where there are flaws in your arguments.
Yeah.
And then the CMA took that back and came out with this pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
So Microsoft has already spent a good deal of time trying to argue. It may be that there's no real path forward that they haven't already trodden. That does not involve, deal making, and by that I mean what you were suggesting, where some IP shenanigans start to happen, where there is a company spun off, or the IP falls under some extra weird contract with the state where they agree that it will always be like multi-platform in as long as it survives or whatever. It's
right.
Who knows? We're in sort of uncharted territory at this point, and who knows what someone wants to do with a $67 billion deal. So,
like, I mean, Activision doesn't want it to implode, because I think it would put Activision, even though like the last Call of Duty sold exceptionally well, which is a different position than they were in when the Microsoft buyout happened, where the last Call of Duty had done really poorly.
Did not meet expectations.
Yeah. This one did exceptionally well, and they're like, okay, well,
we're back, baby.
It's unclear if Microsoft pulls out, if the stock price of Activision tanks as a result of it. Which, I mean, I'm almost certain it would. Sometimes
for a bit,
deals get broken, like the stock price jumps up, but presumably, their stock is not wildly inflated. At least before the stock or before the offer, because they were able to report huge gains on a good deal of their titles. So I mean, but I would imagine that like Bobby Kotick and people like that are looking for a golden parachute to get out of there, and this $68 billion buyout is one of the ways that will happen. And if they back out of it and the stock price drops, so does Bobby Kotick's short-term profitability.
Right. Yeah. His equity falls, his valuation falls.
Right.
Not great things. So they're, we're at it feels like, given that response, we're at the wheel and deals phase.
Yeah. And they don't have a whole lot to wheel and deal, and it's really going to be interesting to see if there's kind of like a united push from both the US and EU to be like, hey, actually this is a real problem. Like, we need more assurances from Microsoft that the IP is not going to be exclusively wielded on their behalf to really prop up their streaming service, which 100% that's the reason why they're trying to buy Activision. Is like, if we buy Activision, we can make Activision games exclusive to Game Pass, or at least we have the choice to do that. And by doing that, we can make Game Pass so interesting a streaming service that there's going to be no competition. People will have to jump on our platform to be competitive with us, or to stand to have their games played. And it's hard to say exactly what that looks like, because we're in that weird transition period. But I think we're in a true transition period that like movies were in when Netflix came out, and then suddenly they started seeing DVD sales like start to plummet, and then once they finally plummeted fully, like streaming was like DVD sales are done. Like now you can go into a Best Buy and it's a lot of them don't even carry DVDs anymore.
No, like $5 if they do.
Well, like old DVDs, but like Blu-ray and
Oh, the new
now like
discs,
Blu-rays
Blu-rays.
and yeah, and like in
Those are oddly expensive.
you know,
Oddly and
because I think
frustratingly
it's most
expensive.
people are like if only the people who really want it buy Blu-rays at this point.
Yeah, they're niche. Yeah.
And I think places people like Disney would be like, actually, we want you on a streaming service, so we're going to make it
Yeah.
expensive and hard to get. So
Yeah.
just jump onto a streaming platform. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think we're in that weird transition period. It may take longer for the game industry to get there, but I think lowering a $400-$500 barrier for people to play games is, I think, what all the platforms will eventually try to aim for. Um, and Microsoft getting way ahead of it by owning like 70% of IP would give them a killer position that would be hard to take down and could definitely kill things like Sony's gaming division or Nintendo's, assuming that they don't pull a Nintendo pivot that works really well for them.
Yeah.
Um, I let's see what questions did I have. Yeah, I think we kind of addressed those questions.
I was
so
gonna
I'm not
say.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have any other feelings on it that we didn't
No,
cover?
I mean it's an ongoing thing. I suspect we'll hear more about it, and we'll be able to chat more about whatever the next curveball is.
Yeah.
You know, when that ball is thrown, we'll see it go by and
I mean, it's been a
follow
long
it.
time since we heard from the EU and the US, so I
Yeah,
imagine we'll have those coming down the pipe at some point. And I think the
they may be
EU's
seeing a wait and playing. Keeping a wait and see based on this. It's almost like, oh, the CMA is doing our work for us right now.
yeah, I have a feeling. I think,
Sure.
and not only that, like there's some weird stuff going on when the US regulatory board was like, "Hey, here's what we find problematic about it," and even the UK said it. The UK's like, "We didn't say that. Your argument's
Right.
flawed," and they're like,
Yeah.
"Okay." So,
Yeah.
anyways, I guess that's it for this week. Those are the three topics. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. And you can check out the rest of our content on our YouTube channel. So thanks everybody for showing up today. I guess we'll talk again next week.